Hello, good morning. Welcome back to the Desi Buzz Talk Show. I'm here today. I'm your host, Dr. Shabana Parvez, and I have with me Kavitha Rajagopalan. Kavitha is a founding member of the Asian Media Initiative and at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism. And this is the first national program dedicated to supporting in-language and community-based journalism for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the U.S. Kavitha is also the author of Muslims of Metropolis, Stories of Three Immigrant Families to the West, published by the Rutgers University Press. She holds a master's in international affairs from Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs and a BA from the College of William and Mary. She is also the recipient of a Fulbright Scholarship in Political Science, and she also has a lot more that we're going to talk about as we delve into the interview. Welcome, Kavitha.
Thank you so much for having me here, Dr. Parvez. This is a pleasure.
Just to start off, just tell us a little bit more about your journey, Kavitha, and especially what drives your passion towards journalism. And as we go further, we're going to talk about global migration and advocacy for communities.
Absolutely. So, as you can imagine, my parents were immigrants from India. My parents were both from the South, but even within those stories, early on in my childhood, I started to understand how migration had defined their identities, even within India. My mother's family is from Kerala, and they're from a part of Kerala that was previously a part of Tamil Nadu. And my
Mhm.
father is from Tamil Nadu, but even his family is from a very different part of Tamil Nadu, closer to the coast that had settled into the city. So even before they migrated to the United States, their whole lives were defined by migration. And
Mm.
growing up in North Carolina, as I did, we did not have a very large Indian community. So
Mhm.
we started to relate to other communities that had different migration histories as well. Black communities, Latino communities, and North Carolina, which many people do not know, is actually the secondary site of a pretty sizable refugee resettlement, largely from Southeast Asia, which all took place after we had left. But I started thinking about how we connect with each other, how we find common ground with each other, and what actually defines the sense of enmity. You, as a South Asian woman, will understand that throughout my childhood, every step of the way, I was told by countless friends, relatives, that I wasn't really Indian, even though I had two Indian parents who
Mhm.
were brought together through arranged marriage and
Mhm.
endogamous arranged marriage as well. So
Mhm.
I started very early on to question this idea of who is a particular identity, what
Mhm.
constitutes belonging, what constitutes community. And so we relocated a few times in my childhood. When I graduated from college at William and Mary, I'd graduated with a degree in theory. And I thought it was very, very important at that time for me to start kind of complicating these abstract theories. At that time, this was the late 90s. The entire world was really obsessed with some of these kind of sweeping abstractions about global south versus global north, the developing world versus the
Mhm.
developed world, the clash of
Mhm.
civilizations, the east versus
Right.
the west. And of course, all of this was coming to a head in the post Cold War period when all of these nations were reforming and people were really struggling to define their sense of self and their community. So I decided to do this by kind of taking brief forays into journalism. I worked as a city beat reporter in South India, in my father's hometown in Chennai. For about 2 years, on and off, I was going back and forth doing some different things. And then I went back to Germany, where I had done my undergraduate study abroad year with my Fulbright scholarship to begin studying what would eventually become a book. And while I was there, this was kind of in the pre 9/11, but post 1993 World Trade bombing and around the Iraq war era, kind of the build up to what became the invasion of Iraq, but at that time had been, a pre existing US occupation or
Mhm.
military presence in the Middle East for some time. So
Mhm.
I was kind of starting to look at what these communities were experiencing in other Western countries as well. And so I started to research political identity formation among the Turkish community there, which had been
Right.
there as guest workers since the
Right.
1960s. And
Mhm.
at this point, the guest worker community had now come into the second and third generations and was demanding political visibility. There were candidates running for offices, there were unions, there were, political parties being formed. And I was very intrigued by this. And very soon I started to understand that a very sizable percentage of this population, this so-called Turkish population, was actually Kurdish. In the
Mm.
neighborhood that I lived in Berlin, people would say, oh, well, these Turks, look over there, these Turks. But all around, I saw Palestinians over here, Bangladeshis over here, Tamil people from Sri Lanka over here.
Mhm.
And then over here, I saw some Turkish people, but then within those communities, a huge population of Kurdish people who had been demanding their own kind of visibility and
Mm.
freedom for a long time. And we're finding that in diaspora, in Germany, there were German policies were being applied to further their own ethnic cleansing that had taken place in Turkey. So I started to
Mhm.
think to myself, oh, this is a very complicated mix here all over the world.
Yeah.
We're talking about Muslims versus the West, but who is the West? What is the West? Who are
Mhm.
Muslims? Then I
Right.
came back, I was like, okay, I got to go back and do some more studying. So I went to grad school. I started grad school on September 4th, 2001. So
Oh.
1 week later, and I
Mhm.
started grad school at Columbia in New York City. So I
Mhm.
saw the second tower fall from, the 15th floor.
Mhm.
A lot of my colleagues in grad school were aid workers who had been in conflict zones all over the world, who worked with refugee communities all over the world. A lot of those folks started kicking in very quickly into kind of direct response, immediate response,
Mhm.
disaster response. For me, I started thinking to myself, okay, well, how is this going to shape New York City life and immigrant life here? So I started visiting communities in Queens and Southern Brooklyn where there were just massive amounts of violence that were being perpetrated on these communities and were
Mhm.
absolutely not penetrating the mainstream headlines all over the
Mhm.
city, leave alone nationally. They were not making, kind of puncturing the consciousness of the city itself. I went
Mhm.
to, for example, the home of a family where they had a basement masjid. And this family, their sons were all US citizens. And because they were religious, they had been subject to repeated FBI raids or law enforcement raids. Unmarked cars would come into their houses in the middle of the night. The women were uncovered and they would break into their doors and just take these US citizens without warrants. And nobody was talking about it. In our communities, people were protesting outside of these prisons and detention centers. This was
Mhm.
all well before even special registration happened. And
Mm.
no one was aware of what was happening. We saw entire neighborhoods be decimated. We saw
Oh.
entire families be broken into pieces. And then over the years, we saw how those communities were turned against each other through mass surveillance, through espionage. And so I became very, for want of a better word, activated at that time. I said, it's very important to have voices out there who are, I don't identify as a journalist. I am a writer, but I believe that immigrant storytelling has to create room and space for subjectivity, for emotional truth. And most immigrants and
Mhm.
refugees, even if they arrive legally, have experienced trauma,
Mhm.
the trauma of the rupture of identity, displacement, loss. And most of our communities, Asian Americans are the fastest growing immigrant population in the United States. We are the
Yes.
most linguistically diverse, but
Mhm.
within our communities, we have massive amounts of uninterrogated historic trauma and repression and oppression within our communities. For example, the Indian American community now has the third largest undocumented population in the United States today, with more than 700,000 people that we know of. And our community has very little collective conversation about what this means for us here in the United States, why this is happening now, and what
Mhm.
bearing this has to what's happening in South Asia amid mass climate change and political conflict and basically political crisis
Mm.
across South Asia. So that's kind of where I got into it. There's a kind of a braid of journalism, which I also have
Mhm.
this complicated relationship with, of
Mhm.
narrative, of literary narrative, but basically understanding what democracy and identity mean for diasporic communities, the oldest and largest diasporic communities in the world.
Right. Well, that's definitely a reason to get activated and clearly very passionate about that. So how did you end up becoming how did it actually lead to you formed the Asian Media Initiative and you became the director? How did that happen? Was this because of you're seeing what was happening and then you created this initiative, or tell us a little bit
So
about
when
that.
when I was reporting my book, so the book I started working on, as I told you, in 2001.
Hmm.
And the book ultimately didn't come out until 2008. At that time, the book focuses on three different families. There's a Bangladeshi family. It's actually Bangladeshi Pakistani family here in New York,
Hmm.
and a Palestinian family in London, and a Kurdish. It's a Turkish and Syrian Kurdish family in Berlin, in Germany. And so I started looking at these different families, and I realized that as I was working through this 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 effort to kind of complicate the dialogues. By this point in 2008, U.S. politics had already changed. President Obama had been elected, but then we would see in the coming years how under the Obama administration we would see mass drone warfare escalate. We would see mass deportation, mass detention escalate. We would
Hmm.
see how this idea of liberal versus conservative on the national political stage in the United States did not translate into kind of justice and rights for immigrant communities across the United States and for their diasporic communities overseas. We started to see how the world could not be, US politics could not be understood within this simplistic binary. So I
Right.
started participating in these policy spaces. I became a fellow at the World Policy Institute, and I started writing op-ed columns and just basically working on more work. My next work, my plan was to ultimately put together a project on cumulative undocumentedness,
Hmm.
understanding that especially South Asian migrant communities often exist in multiple degrees of irregular immigration. For
Right.
example, I met this guy who was a Bhutanese Nepali refugee who was displaced from Bhutan. They were exiled from Bhutan into Nepal. And within Nepal, they were given no opportunity. The Nepali refugee camps were less militarily constrained than, say, for
Hmm.
example, in Thailand or elsewhere, in East Africa, for example. So in
Hmm.
Nepal, refugees were allowed to move freely from those camps. So here's a person who is a refugee, who is in exile, who is a member of a linguistic minority from Bhutan with identity, a Nepali identity. They identify as Nepali. But who ultimately ended up moving into Sikkim regularly across the Indian border, where India had this open border with Nepal, and
Right.
became a cyclical, undocumented labor migrant, a seasonal
Mm.
migrant. So he's stateless, he's undocumented, he's a migrant worker, he's a seasonal worker, and he's a refugee. Then he gets resettled here to the United States after about 15 years as a stateless person, and is now an immigrant in the United States. That's a
Mm.
lot of different identities. That's a
Yeah.
lot of different ways of interacting with states. So
Hmm.
I'm researching all of this. I'm becoming more and more involved in understanding what cumulative undocumentedness and like just the relationship between your identity, your immigration status, and the state under which you live and the city under which you live, how all of these things interact. When in 2016, my son was born with a life-threatening primary immunodeficiency. I
Mm.
stopped working for about 7 years.
Hmm.
And when I came back to work, while I was reporting this book in the 2000s, I had found that some of my most illuminating and eye-opening sources were reporting that was coming out of the so-called ethnic press, these neighborhood community newspapers,
Mm.
journalists who were not only covering communities, but were also leaders and members and often advocates within those communities. So I started to think, well, what's going on here? And then out of the blue, a friend of mine invited me to become the newsletter editor for this newspaper. At this time, my son was still unwell and was recovering. He is, by the way, completely healed at this point and has entered
That's
into long
great.
term survivorship.
Uh-huh. Great.
But we ended up, I ended up taking this part time newsletter job. And I joined this team, the Center for Community Media, at a very critical time in its own evolution as well. The Center
Mhm.
for Community Media had historically been kind of a professional association for ethnic press and for neighborhood, hyperlocal independent press in New York City. And at this point, they were repositioning themselves as a national resource center for
Mm.
community based journalism for immigrants and for communities of color, for people of color.
Mhm.
Saying that, at this point, we were starting to see that in the journalism landscape, there was this kind of precipitous decline in local journalism across the country. And it was very important for us to say that local journalism had not only never really served communities of color, especially Asian immigrant communities, but had also in many ways actively harmed our communities, had
Mm.
put us as, perpetrators,
Yeah.
and
Put it in the
had
wrong way.
advanced Islamophobia, like all kinds of crazy. I mean, you remember the mid
Mhm.
2000s, the just Sharia
Yeah.
law panic all over the country.
Yeah.
There's still 32 states that have bans on Sharia law across the United States. And we take this together with the 23 different states that have instituted property bans against Chinese immigrants. Like, this is
Mm.
an ongoing issue. So I started to think to myself, oh, this may be a really interesting opportunity for me to reconnect with the complexity of immigrant stories by studying the evolution and the emergence of this new era of Asian American community journalism.
Mhm.
At the time, the Center for Community Media had a Black media initiative and a Latino media initiative, but not an Asian media initiative. I think, as we all know, I think the diversity in our communities can be a little bit overwhelming for people who are not from our communities. It can be for us
Right.
too, but we see ourselves, we understand each
Yeah.
other. So I was able to, work very closely with my leadership at the school to advocate after a couple of years of kind of organizing and thinking it through with the community. We launched in 2022 as the first organization. And I think the first order of business was really to say, you know, where are we now? We are no longer a collection of free newspapers, community in language newspapers that you pick up at our community grocery stores or restaurants. We now have podcasts. We now have human rights documenting projects. We now have lifestyle magazines. There is, for example, a bridal magazine that is exclusively for Iranian Jewish women. There is
Wow.
a
Quite
right?
specific. Quite
There
niche. Yeah.
is there is a magazine that is specifically for Punjabi truckers.
Mhm.
It's about, just light. I mean, this is our community has an appetite for storytelling that will not be quenched. So over the last 2 years, I've really been trying to get my arms around the space. What does community journalism look like for our communities now that we are seeing a rise of authoritarianism across
Mhm.
Asia? What does
Mhm.
it look like now that we're seeing massive climate catastrophe where our communities are being displaced, where states and
Absolutely.
nations within Asia
Mhm.
are becoming massive immigrant destinations? And what does it mean for journalism for Asian Americans when, with the fall of Kabul and the fall of Hong Kong, when our free press pillars in Asia are being pushed into diaspora or into
Mhm.
digital space, when our
Mhm.
communities are consuming news not just on, from streaming platforms, from our news, from ZTV or whatever, from back
Mhm.
home, but also from Via TV and from Desi Talk, and from here within the United States, but also from WhatsApp, from
Mhm.
WeChat, from all over the place, and from Facebook, from TikTok.
Yeah.
We are consuming and creating our stories in this massive network that is global. And we are also trying to communicate so that we can be visible and have access to basic rights and services in the United States and in our very neighborhoods where we live. You can
Right.
hear stories in ethnic press that are talking about land use debates around whether to construct a casino in Queens, and at the same time are talking about what does the internet shutdowns in Bangladesh and the student protests in Bangladesh, this rapid transition and the fall of the Sheikh Hasina regime, what does that actually mean for Bangladeshis here? Do you know,
Mhm.
in New York alone, there are at least 20 different Bangladeshi language newspapers in New York alone?
Well, that's
and there are
impressive. No,
communities all over. Yeah,
yeah.
we have
So how did
stories
you
to tell.
like? So you were trying to bring all of these media kind of together or connected in a database, sort of.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
okay, and then tell me you this. I wanted to talk to you about your report on Asian media on the front lines. Um,
yeah.
this is this is what kind of fed into your report as well, seeing like how all of these smaller local level uh, uh, journalistic, different pieces are reporting on the diversity and really diversity of and complexity of the Asian population in different
Yeah.
communities. Yeah.
And the Asian story, right. So before the Asian Media Initiative launched in 2022, I realized that we needed to do some kind of storytelling about the sector itself.
Mhm.
Now, there already exist some kind of national organizations that think about the Black press and think about Latino press
Mhm.
nowhere near enough. But they do exist. But the Asian press, the Asian American community press, is not a well conceptualized or particularly visible space.
Mhm.
So I started to write this report. This was in 2021, the report came out. I was really looking at how the convergence, how Asian American community media, diverse media, and including Pacific Islander media, were responding to these converging crises of the COVID-19 pandemic, of the anti-Asian hate crisis,
Mhm.
and and also just rising disinformation targeting our communities from overseas, and just massive polarization that was resulting from these influence campaigns from overseas and in digital space. And
Mhm.
we now see how that's escalated over time. So I was really looking at that, and we were able to kind of create a frame around this. We then, in 2022, after we launched in 20, we began compiling the first national map and directory of the sector. So
Mhm.
in 2023, we launched the report. It took quite some time. There are at this time 683 outlets in the map and directory serving Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders across the continental United States, and in US territories and colonies and freely associated states across the South Pacific, and
Mhm.
across Asia. These are also now in the directory. So we have this 683 outlets serving Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in 56 different languages, which is not anywhere near the number of languages that are spoken here in the United States. And as we put this map and directory together, we started to realize that while we do have this very robust and innovative and diverse ecosystem, Asian Americans who are not served at all in mainstream and traditional media, there are also massive amounts of our population, vast segments of our communities, who are not served inside our community media either. So
Mhm.
I started to think, how can our community media really come together to serve, you know, tribal indigenous communities, LGBTQ communities, multiracial communities, communities that have not been represented from our countries of origin, caste oppressed communities who are within our world here, and who in many cases are the leaders of our political awareness movements and our community organizing, our efforts to bring rights and visibility to our communities. These are the communities who are not being served within our ecosystem. Or is
Mhm.
it just that we need to expand our frame for our ecosystem? So I started to think about this, and
Okay.
then I followed up with Asian Media on the Front Lines last year, in actually this year, in May 2024, on the 100th anniversary of the Johnson-Reed Act, which banned all immigration to the United States from all parts of Asia. We published a massive report, over 80 pages long, called AAPI Media Origins and Futures. And really, this is the first effort that we could find to kind of synthesize the histories of all of these different sectors: Armenian media, Chinese language media, Arab American media. I didn't realize some of the stories are so powerful, and it also reminds you of the power and the promise of community-based journalism. For example, I found out the first ever Indian American journalist who started working here in the United States in the 1920s, went to several newspapers to try and find a job and could not get himself hired, and ultimately got a job at Negro World newspaper, which was owned by Marcus Garvey, and went on to become the editor-in-chief there.
Wow.
So there's this legacy of multiracial democracy that is upheld primarily in the Black press, that can also serve as a template for us in other media sectors as well. And I'm
Mm.
really excited to see some of what's happening now.
So what are some of these, like that story you said, other untold stories about migration that you think the media should focus on more? And uh,
Well,
any,
I think Asian Americans, this is something that Chinese Americans, East Asians have spoken about more frequently, but
this is
Asian
true.
Americans in general have suffered under this burden of kind of historic forgetfulness or historic erasure, really. Where our long legacy, I started researching this and I started to see, the first Chinese language newspaper began publishing in 1854 in the United States. And I started to realize that all of these communities have these two arrived around the same time in the 19th century, as America was becoming this massive, global empire, basically, and was starting to, attract immigrants from across Europe. So at the same time that all of the Russian Jewish immigrants and the Italian immigrants and the Irish immigrants were
Asians were
seeking
also
their
here at the
futures,
same time or
we were
before,
also here. And in
just
many
not
ways,
spoken about.
and
No.
what's interesting is our arrival here was very much driven by U.S. imperialism in Asia. It was a direct result of U.S. imperialism in Asia. For example, the annexation of the Philippines, which we do not learn about in our
Mhm.
history classes here, that prompted what it turns out to be possibly a genocide in the Philippines of an estimated more than 600,000 people were killed in the war following U.S. annexation of the Philippines. And as a result, in the response to that annexation and to that war and to the trauma that was caused by that war, the United States created an entire category of student immigrants who could come here. They call themselves pensionados, and they became the founders of the first Filipino newspapers in the United States, the community newspapers. Just like that, I think all of our journalism was rooted in a history of displacement and activism, really, to
Mhm.
kind of demand rights and freedoms. There were massive assaults against, Indian Americans. The first Indian immigrants that arrived here were Punjabi, and they were sick. Most of them were members of, I think the very first Indian immigrants who touched ground on the United States were actually part of the military guard in Queen
Mhm.
Victoria's military for the UK, as colonial subjects. And so they arrived here and they said, oh, well, our community can start, having some opportunities here. They brought rice farming, to the United States. Asians delivered the economic miracle, for California across the United
Yes.
States. And, some of the largest hate crimes, as with Black press, we see a history how the white led press were not only, kind of not covering violence against Black Americans, they were in many cases actually complicit in mass lynchings or in lynchings across. In the
Mhm.
same way, we saw across the West Coast and in the Midwest how local white led press were complicit in fomenting and inciting violence, and mass lynching and mob riots against Asian Americans. And none of us were spared. There were attacks on Chinatowns, attacks on Filipinos, massive lynchings against Indian Americans.
Mhm.
This is all across our history. So we have a rich legacy, we have an archival tradition that we can look to. And I started thinking about this. And then I started to think about how here in the United States, we have this idea that Asians are permanent foreigners. But then here in New York City, you started to see how between 1890 and 1945, there were over 100, there were like something like 55 different Arabic language newspapers who were being published here. There were over 100,000 Arab Americans here in Little Syria, in New York, for over 50 years. And
Mhm.
those communities were not just driven away because of Johnson Reed, but also because of land use and urban planning policies. Just like
Uh-huh.
Lincoln Center displaced so many Puerto Ricans from the West Side,
Mhm.
as you know, you see the backdrop of the West Side Story, there was a huge Arab community in lower Manhattan that was displaced and
Mhm.
ultimately displaced to Brooklyn. And Sahadi's was founded, the Sahadi's, this famous spice emporium that everyone goes to, Lebanese spice emporium, was founded here and was ultimately displaced to Brooklyn. And that is the same community that faced all of the fallout from post 9/11. So we
Mm.
see over and over again how these patterns repeat themselves. And like they always say, he who does not know his history is doomed to repeat it. We have a right to know our history as Asian Americans here, and we can look to our press. I did not know, for example, that Arab Americans from New York, Arab American New Yorkers, are the ones who innovated the linotype to be able to produce Arabic press. And they
Mhm.
revolutionized Arabic language literature across the entire world. That was New Yorkers that did that. So I think we should know it
Those are
gave
lots
me
of
an
untold
enormous sense of
stories.
pride.
Yeah, that need
Yeah.
to be brought to light. So in now though, now in this recent context of the global crises we've had, like the refugee
Mhm.
crisis, COVID-19, how has this whole, what do you see, how has the discourse around migration evolved or changed in this most recent decade?
Well, I think this is where our press really can step up a little bit. I think for as we all know, community stories are always kind of owned and controlled by a certain group of people. But
Mhm.
we're finding some really powerful things happening across global Asian diasporas now, where you have communities like, for example, the People's Archive of Rural India, or Frontier Myanmar, or the Initium Project, or the Rappler from the Philippines, where there are these media outlets that exist in digital space that refuse to stay silent. You've seen in Gaza how
Mhm.
these journalists are documenting their own genocide.
Mhm.
Being even as one by one journalists are being killed in this war, they are still reporting. And then I have here, there's a in Canada now, I believe, but she also has reporters here in the United States, is an Afghan woman of Hazara descent who is running a newspaper with undercover reporters in Afghanistan,
Mhm.
women journalists. So we're talking about women who are not allowed legally to speak in public, who are undercover doing investigative reporting on the Taliban. They have no hope of changing the Taliban's policies. As the reporters in Gaza have no hope of changing the Netanyahu regime's policies towards Gaza. And as like these caste oppressed rural, workers in India have no hope of changing the policies of the Modi regime, but they're doing it anyway. They're doing it anyway. My feeling is there is some uncaptured power to these narrative efforts of these communities who are saying we will not be shoved back into the darkness anymore. We
Mhm.
are we are going to tell our own stories in our own voice, in our own way, and you can take it or leave it, but we are not hiding anymore, and we're not going to let you erase us anymore. And I've thought for a long time, what is the next step? We still see our foreign policy largely following the templates of the Cold War era, this
Mhm.
containment policy, great wars policy. What would it look like if all of these pro democracy protesters in Iran, in Pakistan, in Myanmar, in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, across India, all of these, in Korea? Look at what they're doing in Korea right now. I
Mhm.
mean, it gives me chills to look at it, not to mention the feminists in Korea, how they've been organizing.
Mhm.
In Hong Kong, all of those protesters for decades. What if there had been some way to network and empower and build power across all of these movements instead of funding the states with weapons that were killing those movements? What if we were able to harness the power of this refusal to be erased, that exists among our people? What if we could learn from them? I take such courage and inspiration from the anti-caste movement in the United States, which has learned and built power together with the anti-caste movement in India, which is over a century old, to bring real power and rights to communities here that Indian Americans insist on erasing to this day. And I
Mm.
take a lot of courage from them.
Yeah, so what lessons, like you said, then can countries learn from these urban immigrant communities in order to build more inclusive policies?
Well, one thing I'll say is maybe instead of looking to our communities, which do tend to recreate these oppressive hierarchies, where who's the community leader? I'm
Mhm.
thinking about what I told you earlier about what I saw in Turkey,
Mhm.
where you had a community that was demanding visibility and political, equity really within as an immigrant community, while also continuing to perpetrate its own atrocities against its
Right.
own minority communities. We see
Mm.
that over and over again. And, who is actually trafficking people? It's
Right.
other Asian immigrants. Who is actually enslaving, who is perpetrating modern slavery in the United States? It's immigrant communities against our own people. So obviously, the work of solidarity has some way to go within our
Mm.
communities. But what I'll say is, I'll look to Asia, where you do have authoritarianism has existed in Asia for a long time. This past summer, I went to India for the first time in a long time because, as I mentioned, my son had been sick. We weren't allowed to travel. Now that
Mhm.
my son is well, we visited India for the first time. It was this massive homecoming. I mean, I cried. When you
Mhm.
touch home soil for the first,
Mhm.
the smell of home, and and then seeing your people, and just it felt so amazing. And I had a dinner with some of my friends that I'd worked with at the newspaper years and years ago. And they told us, they said, look, you all are talking about authoritarianism and democratic backsliding and what it's going to look like and when it comes. Well, it's been here in Asia for over 10 years in India, and it's been there across Asia for much longer. But a lot of these countries also have massive informality, right? You have
Mhm.
fairly, constrictive states that are somewhat opposed to free expression and rights and are trying to control some of the institutions. But you also have these massive networks of people who have been communicating for over a century in these very free ways. Look at the histories of Radio Ceylon, or look at the histories of it across Bangladesh and these coastal communities. They still have these newspapers where communities will write their village news on
Mhm.
the end of a report and then pass it on to the next village to add their story, and it'll continue that way. We have these old across the Middle East. You have these what are they called, hakawatis or hakawat, these
Yeah.
storytellers that would
Yeah.
go, so they have that. We have these rich narrative traditions to look to for
Mhm.
how people can continue to exist in defiance of power structures that look to erase them, or
So
to
in terms of
ignore
trying to
them.
get social cohesion, like these, we're talking about so many societies that are quite diverse, they're pluralistic. How do you think media and the community media, what is its role in fostering more cohesion, social cohesion?
Well, I've had a lot of conversations with folks about whether our communities deserve to have a paper of record
Mhm.
or a mass, kind of ecosystem of small news outlets that cannot possibly be sustainable, and
Mhm.
how to navigate that. I mean, obviously, how I feel at this point. I believe that
Mhm.
untold, the communities that are not being heard from, that are being marginalized,
Mhm.
should have platforms that they control and that they have
That they
their
have control
power
over.
over
Yeah.
over their storytelling, right?
Mhm.
They should not be edited and modified by, people who do not see them in their full humanity.
Yeah.
But also I will say that even if our community media outlets have leadership that maybe come from a specific point of view, or maybe have some uninterrogated biases, community media leaders are very passionate about the work that they do. I mean, there's not a single person who is, becoming a multimillionaire from doing this work. They're
Mhm.
doing it as an active service to their communities. And in this age of polarization and disinformation, I'm hearing from our publishers and our colleagues how impossible it is to serve our communities that are this deeply conflicted,
Mhm.
and this deeply divided. So I do think it's important to have sort of platforms that are kind of our town square, our public
Mhm.
square, that are clearinghouses for all of us to come together. I don't think fragmentation in the end really serves us well.
Right.
But
What are
but
the
what
critical
should that
skills
look
then?
like?
Yeah, what are the critical skills that journalists then should have to cover these issues? The issues with immigrant communities, migration. What kind of skills do you think journalists should have for making this
Yeah.
a better job? I guess.
Well, I think this is the hard part. I think the question becomes, do you as a publisher create endless news products? Like there's a publisher in Georgia who
Hmm.
has different podcasts in different languages for different Asian communities that exist there, knowing that members of one community aren't going to listen to what's happening
Yeah.
there. But I start thinking to myself, like, how powerful would it be for, Indian Americans and Filipino Americans who do have some kind of shared community spaces, physical
Hmm.
spaces, or Korean Americans and Chinese Americans, or, looking here at immigrant communities across the United States, there are very few outlets that are explicitly Pan Asian. Like I look at
Hmm. Right.
Seattle Chinatown. Seattle Chinatown is the Seattle International District is the only by design explicitly Pan Asian Chinatown in the
Hmm.
entire country. But even the ones that are not by design that way, like Jackson Heights, everyone thinks it's an Indian neighborhood, but it was
Hmm.
one point a Pakistani neighborhood, then it became a Bangladeshi neighborhood, and then embedded within it now are Tibetan Nepali communities, and
Hmm.
all people are sort of together. It's
Hmm.
now a multiracial, multi-ethnic mecca where people are not really integrating or sharing stories, but they're sharing space.
Hmm.
So that's kind of my curiosity. I want our journalists who are I want them to have I want our public journalists are extremely skilled. First of all, there's not an Asian community journalist that is not already running a print outlet, a digital outlet, creating news
Hmm.
platforms, creating apps, creating streaming services, creating engagement vehicles, publishing on WhatsApp, connecting with audiences where they
Right.
are, doing events. So you
Hmm.
already have more skills than most journalists in mainstream media. What you
Hmm.
need is funding. And I would love for there to be massive pooled funds for our journalists so that you can take the time. What's actually needed is time to observe the community
Yeah.
and to really find meaningful ways to create community interactions and
Hmm.
spaces together. I think about when I was growing up in North Carolina, like I told you, we didn't grow up in Jackson Heights. We didn't have an Indian or, Jersey City or Edison or what have you, where we had an Indian community where everybody spoke Tamil all the time. We had a multi-ethnic, you know, South Asian community where our friends, our Indian friends, were Gujarati, Marathi, all different types of, from different caste backgrounds, were Hindu, Muslim, it was all different ways of being Indian together. And
Hmm.
I benefited from that. I
Hmm.
benefited from that in ways that a lot of my friends who grew up in these very insular Indian enclaves did not. And I
Hmm.
think our communities, as we grow and become more complicated and larger and more diverse, how will we benefit is by being able to have solidarity across our differences.
Hmm. I want to go back to something that you said a little bit when you start talking about the Taliban and the women that are actually, letting their voices be heard. Because you are also on the board of something called Unchained at Last. Talk a little bit about your advocacy there, which focuses on helping women kind of, leave forced marriages, or, how
Yeah.
how does that tie in with the rest of your work? And
Yeah,
talks a little
I
bit
was
about.
on the board for many years, and then when my son got sick, I moved away from it. But it's an
Mhm.
incredible organization. It was founded by this woman named Frady Reese, who is, and she was raised in an ultra-Orthodox Jewish community in New Jersey, and ultimately left both her marriage and her community, and I just is one of the most powerful women I've ever met in my life. And
Mhm.
she became very close friends while she was studying. This amazing story that she told that, she was not allowed to pursue an education while she was, within her community. And then ultimately, after she left her community, after she left her marriage, she decided that she wanted to get an undergrad degree. And so she Googled college, New Jersey,
Mhm.
and found that she just like did an internet search and ended up being accepted in Rutgers. And there she forged a really lifelong, lasting friendship with a Palestinian woman who is actually, I believe, from Gaza, if I'm not mistaken. And the two of them together became basically sisters. They became close friends. And they founded this organization really to help women leave coercive, forced, and arranged marriages. And they brought
Mhm.
me on because some of the largest arranged marriage community in the United States is Indian American. But the
Mhm.
Indian American arranged marriage situation is, it's different. There are so many different layers. It's really orients itself to class.
Mhm.
What I ended up doing, though, is starting to talk to a lot of women who, I think because of the challenges of immigration, the immigration system now, I don't think people are aware of how many challenges and barriers even highly skilled immigrants from South Asia are facing right now. It's
Mhm.
not just undocumented immigrants, but our H-1B visa holders, their spouses are not allowed to work or not permitted to work. In
Right.
order to become an H-1B visa holder, I don't think I need to tell this audience how
Right.
much you have to go through or how
Right.
long you have to wait or how expensive it is and how long the backlogs are for green
Mhm.
cards
Yeah.
for H-1B visa holders in our communities. So I think I started to realize how marriage was becoming kind of this mechanism for immigration. It's always been that way for many of our communities,
Mhm.
but how that was orienting itself towards, arranged marriage and towards the further oppression of women, how
Mhm.
women US citizens were being coerced into, kind of coercive arranged marriages with men who wanted to immigrate here for work purposes but couldn't find any other way. So there are all of these ripple effects that you
Mhm.
see when a country like the United States refuses to fully reckon with and make room for its immigration reality, all the different ways that that feasts upon traumas and
Mhm.
oppressions within communities, especially within patriarchal communities, to further the oppression of women, especially vulnerable women, especially rural women, especially women without status, wealth, and power in our
Right.
communities. And we saw this, some of the families that I was working with, these are women who endured, who were also, it also worked in the other way where there were women who were brought here as spouses, but were ultimately then kind of put into positions of being indentured servants, experienced
Mhm.
enormous amounts of abuse because they weren't allowed to work, they weren't allowed to have their own accounts. There were all kinds of limitations that they were facing as a result of their immigration status. And
Right.
really unconscionable for a country that positions itself as a champion for women's rights
Or right,
overseas.
women's rights or human rights. It's true.
Yeah.
As you talk about, you also do some teaching, right? You've done quite a bit of teaching. And you've taught on these topics of migration, and also even teaching about writing. What kind of advice would you give to aspiring journalists, researchers, or young people who want to focus on these issues on migration?
It's interesting you say that. I have a daughter who's 12 years old, and she tells me she wants to be a journalist. And
Mhm.
I worry for her just because the field of journalism is in such a state of flux, and it's also not a particularly safe or
Safe,
welcoming place
right?
for young women of color.
Yeah.
My husband is African American, and my children are biracial, which
Hmm.
I think is their superpower, but it also means that they're experiencing multiple kind of barriers to being accepted in both
Hmm.
communities and in the wider world as a whole. My daughter, thankfully, I'm not sure where she gets it, but she's quite a vocal feminist.
No idea where that came from.
I don't know where that came from, but it's interesting because sometimes she browses on my bookshelves and She's been reading Octavia Butler and,
Mm,
Maurice Condé and, Margaret Atwood. And,
mhm,
she comes with me to gatherings. I'm part of this collective of South Asian and women of color writers.
mhm.
We're putting out on December 12th our first anthology. This was an
Oh,
organization that was curated by this Sri Lankan American writer, Naomi Munawira, who's, I don't
mhm,
know if you've ever seen her work, beautiful writer, and she's very dedicated to collective liberation for women, for brown women and for black women,
mhm,
for women of color. And so she brought together these writing circles for women of color. And out of these circles, which we started calling our coven, because it really felt like at a certain point, this
mhm,
sort of spell casting was happening where women were
mhm.
telling their stories of their
Right.
grandmothers and their mothers and this stuff. So she created this anthology. So my daughter has attended some of those. We have all kinds of really interesting histories here from, South Asian feminist poets and writers,
Mhm,
and she's been reading a lot of this work. So the advice that I really have for young writers is, one, don't restrain yourself to one particular sort of writing format.
mhm,
It's always useful to learn the tools of journalism, but to not be limited by it.
mhm,
Read poetry, read lots of different types of literature. And also, we should know our history. So that means that we should not just read American literature or American journalism, but we should read the journalism that's taking place overseas. I, for example, strongly recommend reading, this reporting from Afghanistan that I've been telling you about. There are magazines like New Lines magazine, or there are literary reviews like Afikra or Marka's review that really are dedicated to telling stories in a very kind of nuanced and powerful way. So
mhm,
it's journalism, but plus. So they're literary, they're nonfiction, they're narratives. We shouldn't feel constrained by the concept of journalism. I find a lot of young journalists feel very constrained by the pressures of fact checking and
mhm.
corroborating. I tell my daughter, I said, look, obviously it's important to get the facts correct. You shouldn't misrepresent a story. But
Mhm.
if you are telling stories, if you're reporting on communities, the most important thing is to understand the identities and the emotional truths of the people that you're reporting on,
So that you
you
can
know?
accurately represent them. Yeah.
Yeah, so read their histories, read our
Mhm,
foremothers. We should read our foremothers.
mhm. Yeah. What you mentioned this anthology. Is that your next project? Like, what is next for you in terms of projects at the Asian Media Initiative or research or writing? Is that your
The
next
Asian
big
Media
thing?
Initiative will continue to network journalists and work towards building sustainability inside the
Mhm,
sector. Sustainability will have to come through growing audience, but also through, creating new mechanisms for, getting revenue and resources for our communities. For me personally, I am becoming more and more interested in sort of, diasporic democracy for Asian Americans.
mhm,
So I'm
mhm,
in the process now of putting together a new book that will look at free expression and what does democracy actually mean for communities that exist in global diasporas under
mhm,
multiple regimes and in digital space. I do believe our world is, shadowed by a parallel world. We do exist within a multiverse already,
right.
where
Mm,
our world and the digital world are kind of coexisting in these weird parallels where we inflect
mhm,
each other. But
mhm,
the digital world has a life of its own, and it
mhm,
has a reality of its own, but it's in many ways kind of dictating how we perceive and exist in our real world, our physical world. So I'm kind
mhm.
of curious to tell those stories and hear more about that work.
In all your roles in media, your research, your advocacy, and what kind of lessons of, say, leadership lessons have you learned?
Well, I think, these days, the models of leadership that we see in institutions, in governments, are really quite top down
Mhm,
and strict and very much oriented towards, preserving a structure and towards making sure that everyone is speaking with a unified voice. But I would love to see a world in which, I mean, especially, I wouldn't necessarily be able to translate this to a larger scale, but in my very, very small corner of the Asian Media Initiative, I have really found that, leadership really means listening and, and allowing people to express themselves in very complex ways and
Mm-hmm.
to also dictate how things are set. So I can't, for example, when we were creating the map and directory, we had a small research team. We decided collectively how we were going to define our communities, what languages we were going to include, how we were even going to name and spell the languages that were being
Mm-hmm.
used. We had, and that within our team, all of this research methodology involved kind of focus groups and listening sessions with complex members of the community, with, kind of groups, networks of community members. We didn't, for example, just, go to the US Census and say, oh, how are
Mm-hmm.
you defining these communities? Or what do you,
Right.
or go to, one or two community leaders and say, oh, well, what's the national language of Nepal? Is it Nepali?
Mm-hmm.
Or,
Right.
because we know that there's been a history of linguistic ethnic cleansing and
Mm-hmm.
linguistic cleansing in a lot of our communities, and that there is kind of linguistic genocide that's happened in places like Nepal and Turkey,
Mm-hmm.
across Myanmar. We know that this has happened. So we thought
Right.
it was really important to be able to, in China, for example, so we thought it was really important to be able to hear how people represent their own communities. And yes, it made things a little bit messy. It meant that our data was not standardized and very easy to translate into data. But I'm also starting to think that maybe data is not going to be the path towards liberation for our people. Like, maybe
Mm-hmm.
data won't save us. Maybe we
Yeah.
have to operate within a data landscape, but we also have to allow there to be complexity.
Mm-hmm. What has your most rewarding professional accomplishment been so far?
I have to say, you know, writing a book was really special. It's a very painful process. I think anyone who writes long
Mm-hmm.
form will agree. It's
Yeah.
very painful, and I think in the first years after it's born, it's kind of like having a kid, and I'm a mom, I have 2
Mm-hmm.
children.
Mm-hmm.
I think you doubt yourself a lot, and when the book is first born, you think, "Oh, all the mistakes that I made with it, I've messed it up, and it's awful."
Mm-hmm.
But now in retrospect, it's been more than 15 years since my book came out, and I'm prepared to work on more. I've had other kind of publication opportunities that have come out. Nothing has meant as much as being able to really stretch out. And I look back on it and I continue to see the legitimacy and the value of having these stories told. And I'm truly honored that these people entrusted me with this depth of intimacy of their
Mm-hmm.
stories. I mean, I had people telling me things that they'd never told anyone, so that the entire world could potentially have access to that intimacy. I mean, what a gift, what an honor. So really
That is
being
truly
able to write a
special,
book,
and it's
it's
like a
truly
legacy,
special.
yeah,
I
for
mean,
you
it's
to have
not a
voice.
famous book, it's not like,
Right, but
a
it's
bestseller,
still,
but it exists. And
yeah.
even today, I get messages from people who are finding it and discovering it for the first time today, and learning about the existence of these communities, and
Mhm.
and learning more about themselves, and how their families constructed memories and histories.
Mhm.
And I think that has been I mean, I'm humbled. I think I'm lucky that I wrote it when I was young, because the
Mhm.
older I get, the more self-doubt I have about what right do I have
Right.
to
Yeah.
to to hold other people's stories. But I'm really excited to embark on another one.
Mhm. In all your work, and obviously your mom, you have family, how do you keep what do you feel is your secret sauce, your secret to success, or what keeps you motivated, to keep going? And how do you keep healthy? And how do you maintain, your balance, whether it's emotional, physical, mental, spiritual? How do you keep healthy and, stay focused?
I really have to say it's a community of women, especially women writers, that I've become close with over the years.
Mhm,
We have a network at the Asian Media Initiative, the Asian Media Women's Network, and I've made some tremendous sisters, lifelong sisters there.
mhm,
I have some writing communities. There's a community, it's primarily Black and South Asian
mhm,
women of color writing community that I'm a part of. Um, and I do have to say, obviously my close friends who have walked with me through my son's illness, through my
mhm,
father's passing, through my mother. I've had the dubious gift blessing of being a caregiver for many
mhm,
years. Part of the reason I haven't been able to write another book since that first book came out is because I was a caregiver for about 15 years for my mother-in-law and then my father and then for my son.
mhm,
But I also think, those experiences, they really show you, what it means to survive and what it means to lose. And I think
mhm.
it can only make me a more
Stronger.
empathetic writer
Mhm,
and a stronger person. So I
mhm,
think those are really important. I also am a firm believer in therapy. I have a wonderful South Asian woman therapist
mhm,
who has been working with me to kind of and a lot of the work that you do in therapy is about storytelling and how you tell the story of your life and the story of your children's lives and the
mhm,
story of your mothers. We
mhm,
as South Asian women, we are the keepers of our mothers' stories. The our mothers, my grandmother was a child bride. I mean, she was married
mhm,
when she was 8 years old. My other
mhm,
grandmother was 13 years old. And I do believe firmly that my grandmother was married so young. Even in those days, that was quite young to be married. But she was the only surviving child of her parents who had lost five other children, to
mhm,
childhood illness. I think her marriage was a trauma response. And I
mhm.
think everything that happened from that, I mean, my grandmother was the wife of a great man in his town. Everyone knows his story. Everyone knows my great grandfather's story. No one knows the
It was
stories
her
of the
story.
women.
Yeah.
Yeah, of the
Yeah.
women. And
Mhm,
so I believe that we are keepers of our women's stories and we have to pass these stories on to our daughters as well. I also, I do believe in, exercise is really important if you spend a lot of time
mhm.
sitting and hunching over the screen.
Right? Over the
And
computer?
food, I mean, in our communities, food is medicine, food is
Yeah.
healing, food
Yes,
is
therapy.
religious, is worship, food
Mhm,
is ritual, food is gathering. There is nothing more healing than making a meal and gathering around a
yeah.
meal. And especially, I've spent so much time around different immigrant communities. I went once, I was reporting in Utica on these refugee communities, Karen immigrants from Myanmar.
Mhm,
And we gathered around, they had this a child's birthday party that was actually a church service. And then at the end of
mhm,
it, we all sit around over and over again, our communities, we put a sheet down on the floor and we sit in a circle and we put a plate of breads and a plate of rice and a plate of some sort of soupy thing and then a plate of greens and we touch our hands together, we sip our tea together, we tell our stories together. And that is why I feel so connected to the work that I do with community journalism, because it
mm,
grows out of this story of gathering around a table on a cloth on the floor and telling our stories and singing our songs and our poems. And it's
mhm,
so powerful to me. I remember years and years ago, I had had the good fortune of attending this seminar that was on the ways of indigenous ways of knowing, and it was these scientists who were from these different indigenous nations. There was a Cree man, a Blackfoot man, a Choctaw woman, and a Cherokee woman, and they were all there together. And even though they were from completely different nations, and from completely different linguistic traditions, they said that in each of their traditions there is this story of lighting a fire on a boundary between nations, and for nations to gather around the boundary fire, and in their community they would pass some sort of tobacco or smokable. In our community, it's
It's
maybe
food.
passing a cup of tea, it's food.
Tea. Yeah.
But this idea of gathering where nations collide, and instead
Mhm.
of making it a conflict, make it a place for gathering and storytelling. I find that incredibly healing. The idea that we can make a meal and we can sit at these boundaries. And I think how India has simultaneously the most militarized and the most open borders in the entire world. And I think about which communities are stronger, the community that has the militarized border or the community that has the open border. And I know right now, both sides are, pretty traumatized. It's bad on both
Mhm.
borders. But
Mhm.
I think about how in the past that was different and how in the future that could be different still.
Yeah, that's a very good visual, a kind of way to bring everything together. It's about
The,
community,
if
cohesion, and
there are
telling
these
your stories.
villages on the Turkish-Syrian border, they used to tell me at Ramadan every year for Eid,
Mhm.
they would gather on either side of this militarized border. The Turkish-Syrian border is pretty
Mhm.
firmly controlled and has been since the 60s. But how these villagers, they'd have one village that was divided by this border, and they would gather at Ramadan and feast together,
Mhm.
and they would bring like the different rose jelly from the north and like pomegranate seeds from the south, like they would be together eating. And I think that may be the way forward for our people.
Yeah, it's a beautiful
Gathering.
vision. May we all be able to sit together at a universal table, that would be
Yeah.
a beautiful vision of the future. And maybe we can
Probably
live to see a world
idealistic, but
like that.
let's
That's
hope.
so idealistic, but why not? I mean, it's worth trying to achieve, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's been so amazing talking to you. We're pretty much over time, but it's been really fascinating. You're clearly so passionate about your work and very successful. And I know you have a lot more stories to tell. Um, and I hope we'll meet again soon in
I
some
hope
other path.
so. Thank
Yeah.
you so much for having me. And
Yeah.
thank you to all of your audience. I hope we all stay in touch. Please find
Yes.
me, everyone who's listening in. And it's
Yes.
been such a pleasure. I'm so, so grateful for your work.
Thank you so much. Okay. So see you.